bit now about setting up a still life. So I have 3 pairs here, and I have 2 light sources. And I want you to notice how the shadows get confused when there's more than one light source. So I'm going to turn off a light source here. You can see how much stronger they are. I do still have the overhead light on, so you might see a little bit there, but with the desk lamp you can see it much more closely, much more strongly than the overhead light. Turn that one off, turn this one on. So you can see that the shadows change significantly depending on the light source. I'm going to put them on again, both of them on. The interesting thing about looking at something with more than one light source is it makes the painting much more difficult for us to make it believe. Because look, if you look at this pair, for instance, here, you can see that it has a little bit more shadow on this side. But when I turn this light off, it has significantly more shadow on this side, and we can clearly see the shadow that's on the desk, which makes it, again, gives us something to relate to. Also, what it's kind of interesting to notice is you see the light that's down here. This is the light bouncing off the table and hitting the bottom of the pair. Now, usually in beginner classes, we don't worry about that. We just pretend the whole base of the is shaded like is on this side. But when you look at more advanced pieces, you'll see that they have that differentiation of the light bouncing back onto the lighter surface of the pair. I want to talk just a little bit about the light, the shadows. So I'm going to move this lamp. This is a typical lamp that you can see the circle it's casting here. It starts out very narrow, but it casts a circle. So we know that the light is going like this. It's coming down in a cone. And when you're doing a still life, that gets confusing because the shadow on this side of the still life and the shadow of this side are different. This one will be shorter than it would be if they were all the same length. We can play with that a little bit by moving the light further away. So the further away we take the light, you can see the circle is getting larger and the shadows are getting more similar. What's interesting that you can't see, I'm just going to move the camera, is the tops of the shadows are quite interesting. Move that away. I can also change things by moving the light in closer, but if I lift it up higher, it changes it as well. So you can, when you're setting a still life up at home, you can play with the shadows and decide which direction you want them to come from. That's just the overhead light. I've got this other one set up. So you can see how I can, again, manipulate these shadows by moving the light further away. I can go lower or I can come higher. And you can change the shape of the shadows, as simple as that, which is nice to think about because the shadows are what activates your negative space in a still life. You can see here, if I put the light straight over top of this rounder pair, you can see how the light is a cone shape because the shadow is extending beyond the edge of the pair. If I have that straight up and down on both sides. And that will look odd if you were to do it as a painting. You usually want to aim to have the shadow be the same size as the pair if it's direct lights directly overhead, or moving it away. So if I move this further away, so if I move it down, you can see how wide that shadow gets. If I move it further away, it gets more like we would see it in the real world. So those are things to think about when you're setting up your still life. Another fun thing you can do with your still life is have your pairs close enough to the wall so that you've got shadows on the wall behind them. And that can make the painting more interesting. I can make those shadows longer by bringing the light lower. And of course, if I was sitting lower, those shadows would be different as well. So it helps to see. Now this is a fatter pair, so it's a little further away. If I bring the pairs closer, the shadows get larger again. So you can play with this in setting up your still life, and it makes it a more interesting prospect to be looking at volume and shadow when you can play with it somewhat. Bring that up out of the way. There we go. So keeping it simple here. So looking at the shadows now, the light source is light is coming from this side, and the shadow starts under the pear. It starts under the pear, and it doesn't extend very high up. This is because I've moved the camera farther away. So that's to give us the pear's more of a grounding, I guess you'd call it. Because if I lift the camera up, so just looking now at the height of the shadows on the side of the pear, in order to see this properly, I have to get down to the height of the camera. But I can see that the shadow is coming off the pear at about here. So it doesn't go all the way up. And if I'm sitting down, the shadow, it looks like it's coming off about, like it comes up higher and it extends quite a bit higher. So it's to, when you're drawing your shadows in, to get at a height and stay consistently there while you're drawing them in. That will help it also feel like it's grounded in the real world. Now in this look, I have put paper underneath the pears, so you can see how that changes the shadows of each time. So now remember when we looked at it before, we could see light coming up and hitting the bottom of this pear. With dark under this pear now, we don't see that. We see the shadow underneath that pear all the way around. This one has a bit more of a gray paper underneath it, and so this shadow is looking a little bit darker than this one, which has white paper underneath it. So you can also look at the surface underneath your paper, underneath your pear, to look at what that will do to the pear. Now if I put red underneath this pear, you can see that that red is actually coming up into the pear as well. So we have reflected light hitting here. Instead of being white light coming back now, it is colored with this color, so it comes up into here. And that's maybe not something for you as a beginner, but it's certainly something to notice and to play with as time goes along, because it's a lot of fun to look at those things. You can even see the red in here. It's actually a little bit easier to see it in the camera than it is to see it in the pears themselves. And this shadow is also a lot darker in the camera than it is when I'm looking at it through my eyes here. I'm just going to stop this now, and I'm going to pull up some pebbles and look at those. I have some pebbles set up here now. I'm sorry, it doesn't want to focus on them for some reason. Not sure quite why, but so you can see the shadows underneath them. Now when I move this, I can make those shadows whatever shape I want. So I can make them longer. I can move them to the other side. So you get to decide what tells the story you're wanting to tell with those shadows. What time of day is it? What kind of mood are you wanting to portray? Do you want the shadows to be really long, like a late afternoon? You want them to be early in the morning? I guess that would be further over here. There we go, early in the morning. You can move them around, and again, it's interesting to think about what happens depending on what you put underneath them. I'm just going to slip the paper underneath some of them, and you see how much brighter the stones look when they're on a dark surface. So you can think about how's that going to play. It also helps the shadows look underneath them. So if you're having trouble seeing a shadow on a rock, you can also put something dark underneath it to help you see how the shadow is shaped.